Canoe Lake, Algonquin Park, Ontario, the last week of July, 1933, 20 minutes before full dark. Douglas Whitcomb, 11 years old, out of Rosedale in Toronto, sat cross-legged in the second row of a ring of boys facing an unlit stack of split cedar in a clearing cut into the slope above the shoreline that the camp called, without irony, the Council Ring. Behind him, up the hill, the dining hall's windows had already gone dark for the night. Ahead of him, past the unlit fire, Canoe Lake lay flat and silvering in the last light, the camp's canoes racked in their long, even rows along the waterfront, exactly as they had been every evening since the afternoon program ended. His sweater carried Ahmek's colors. His hands still smelled faintly of lake water and canoe varnish from the day's instruction period. This was his second summer, and he already knew, the way the older boys knew, that nobody spoke while a counselor knelt to strike the fire, and that the particular silence that gathered once the first flame caught the cedar was not an accident of the evening. 9 nights earlier, on his first Sunday back at camp, he had cried quietly into his pillow after lights out, quietly enough that the boy in the next bunk had pretended to be asleep. Tonight, watching the fire take hold and climb against the darkening water, no one among the 60 boys in the ring knew that about him, and it did not seem, to Douglas, to matter that they didn't. That was, he was only beginning to understand, the entire point of the ring he was sitting in. What was a fire built specifically to make an 11-year-old's private grief invisible, and what did Camp Ahmek's council ring actually do, each night of the season, that the rest of a boy's year at home in Toronto never managed to do at all? What the council ring actually did, before it did anything else, was replace a boy's family for 8 weeks with 60 boys and a handful of college-age counselors. And it did this by design, not by accident of geography. Taylor Statten, a Boer War veteran who had spent over a decade as the IMCA's boys' work secretary in Toronto, first saw Canoe Lake on a family trip in 1912. In 1921, he opened Camp Ahmek on its eastern shore, the first Canadian-owned private camp inside Algonquin Park, to 60 boys, for a 6-week season, naming it for the Ojibwe word for the great beaver. 3 years later, his wife, Ethel Statten, opened a sister camp for girls, Wapomeo, on a small island close by. The two camps shared the same daily rhythm, but differed in specifics. Wapomeo's evening program made room for dancing and crafts that Ahmek did not offer, while Ahmek's included boxing and wrestling that Wapomeo did not. Both camps grew through the 1920s into institutions with their own uniform, their own graduated ranks by age. Douglas, at 11, was a pioneer, above the youngest bantams and below the older mountaineers, voyagers and seniors, and their own fixed evening architecture, repeated every night of the season, swimming and canoe instruction ending by 5, supper in a dining hall built to seat the entire camp at once, and then, as the light dropped, the walk up to the council ring. None of this ran on improvisation. A counselor's job was to know the ring's order the way he knew a canoe stroke, which songs opened an evening and which closed it, how long the silence before the first song was allowed to run, when a story could be told and when the fire demanded only singing. Holding that order steady, night after night, season after season since 1921, was what let 60 boys who had arrived from 60 different Toronto households, 9 days or 9 weeks into camp, sit down together in the same ring and feel, without being told to feel it, that they already belonged there. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Canadian cottage and campfire summer between 1920 and 1980, what a specific ritual gave the people who kept it, and what it actually required of them to keep it going, season after season, generation after generation. Not nostalgia for an old photograph of a fire, the documented social architecture of a ritual a generation of Canadian children were sent away from home to learn. For a viewer with no camp of their own in the family, what a council ring gave a boy was not entertainment. It was 1 hour a night in which nobody checked whether he was homesick, because for the length of a song everyone already knew, it genuinely did not matter. And if you, or someone in your family went to an Ontario summer camp in these decades, Ahmek, Wapomeo, or one like them, tell us in the comments what you still remember exactly about the fire circle. Next time on this channel, what happened on the dock the evening the boat finally came back in, and what a Canadian father and child carried home from a lake that the rest of their year in the city never gave them. Back to the fire. The specific thing the ring did to hierarchy is worth stating plainly, because it ran against how the rest of camp operated. During the day, Ahmek ran on rank. Seniors led the longer canoe trips. Pioneers like Douglas took instruction from them. Bantams were kept closest to shore. At the council ring, that structure did not vanish, but it stopped organizing who mattered for the length of an evening. A 15-year-old senior sat inside the same unbroken circle as an 8-year-old bantam, and once the singing started, the songs did not care which boy had passed his canoe test and which had not. What mattered, once the fire caught, was whether you knew the words, and the words were the one thing every boy at Ahmek was taught, deliberately and repeatedly, from his very first night in camp. A boy's first weeks were measured, quietly, in how much of the repertoire he had absorbed. He was not handed a songbook to study on his own. He learned by sitting in the ring often enough that the second verse stopped needing the boy beside him to lead it for him. There was a specific, recognizable moment. Counselors at Ahmek watched for it in every new camper, year after year, when a boy stopped mouthing along a half beat behind everyone else and started singing on time, unprompted, because the song had simply become something he knew, rather than something he was learning. That moment was treated, informally, but consistently, as the boy becoming what older campers at Ahmek called, without much ceremony, one of the ring's own, not because he had accomplished anything measurable during the day, but because the evening circle had quietly decided to consider him part of it. Some of what the ring sang had nothing to do with the wider Canadian campfire tradition at all. Camp-specific songs, written for Ahmek alone and sung nowhere else, including a grace recited after breakfast every morning of the season that named the camp directly. A boy who could recite that camp-specific verse from memory, without prompting, by his second or third week, had crossed a line that had nothing to do with age or rank. Alumni accounts and regional camp historians describe this internal repertoire, distinct from the widely shared songbook material sung at fires across the province, as one of the clearest, most durable markers of belonging a Statten camp produced. Douglas reached that moment on his 9th night at camp, the same week he had cried after lights out, though no one in the ring that evening could have connected the two. Nobody marked the moment out loud. In a ring built the way this one was, nobody needed to. What the ring did for homesickness, specifically, was less about erasing it than about making it survivable without anyone having to admit to it out loud. Ahmek in the 1930s had no formal system for identifying a homesick camper, no counselor training manual, no structured check-in, nothing written down. What it had instead was an unwritten expectation that older campers looked out for younger ones inside the ring itself. A senior shifting to sit beside a new bantam who had gone quiet during a story. An older boy starting the next song, a half beat early, so a smaller one would not be caught out alone on the first line. None of this appeared in camp policy in 1933. It did not need to. It was simply how the ring was expected to work, carried forward each year by whichever boys happened to be its oldest. This same informality had a harder edge, one this channel will not soften to keep the evening comfortable. Ahmek in this era operated years before Ontario's camps answered to any shared external safety standard. The provincial camping association that would eventually set and audit those standards did not yet exist. It would not be founded, with Taylor Statten himself among its founders, until 1937. Swimming instruction, canoe supervision, and open water judgment through the 1920s and into the 1930s were governed entirely by whatever standard an individual camp's own leadership chose to set for itself. Camp historians and the province's own camping association have since documented and openly acknowledged that water safety practice from this period was considerably less rigorous, by every later formal measure, than anything a parent would accept from a licensed camp today. The same ring that taught 60 boys a shared repertoire of songs operated, every daylight hour, on a stretch of shoreline where the margin for a child's safety was set entirely by the adults present that particular summer, with no outside body checking their judgment and no requirement that they meet one. Douglas's own homesickness, in this system, was never diagnosed, treated, or even formally noticed. It simply ran its course inside a ring that had been built, deliberately if quietly, to give a boy somewhere to sit until it passed. There was one night each season when the ring changed character, and every returning camper knew exactly which night it was without being told: the closing council fire, the last one before the boys packed for the train home. The order of songs stayed the same. The circle sat in the same rows it always had. What changed, campers who returned across multiple summers consistently noticed, was the counselors, men who had spent 8 weeks keeping the evening light, even deliberately unserious, now running the ring as though something genuinely being marked was ending. Douglas would not understand this fully until his third summer back, the year he watched a counselor he had privately thought of as unshakable go quiet during the closing song, and not entirely recover his composure for the address that followed it. No camper Douglas's age could have explained precisely what was being marked. It was not simply the calendar end of a season. It was the end of the specific, temporary country the ring had built for 8 weeks. Flat, unranked by home address or a father's income, organized only by how long you had known the words. And every boy in the circle would wake the next morning, back inside the ordinary hierarchy of the world the train was about to return him to. The particular seriousness on a counselor's face on closing night was, Douglas came to understand only years later, simply an adult, noticing openly, the same thing a boy at 11 could feel happening to him, but had no language yet to name. The last song of the season was, by long-standing custom, followed by no announcement, no speech about next summer. The fire was simply allowed to burn down on its own, further than any other night's fire was permitted to, while the ring sat and let it. Before you can fully understand what it meant that a family like the Whitcombs sent a son to Camp Ahmek at all, you need to understand what a camp like Ahmek actually cost, and who, in 1933, could realistically afford to send one there. Private wilderness camps in Algonquin Park and the comparable Temagami district were, historians of Ontario's camping movement have documented directly, expensive by design, institutions that served upper-middle and upper-class Toronto families almost exclusively, many of them already connected through the same private schools, churches, and professional circles across the city. A boy's father was, characteristically, a doctor, a lawyer, a company director, or a man in a comparable profession. A season's fees at a camp like Ahmek in the 1930s represented a substantial share of an ordinary working family's entire annual income. For most Toronto households, camp of this kind was not a possibility to weigh at all, because it was never realistically on the table to begin with. That same decade, a very different kind of camp operated less than 100 kilometers from the city. Bolton Camp, run north of Toronto by the city's Neighborhood Workers Association, brought working-class mothers and children, more than 1,000 of them in its very first season, out of the crowded downtown for a fresh-air stay, explicitly framed, in the language of its founders, as a public health measure rather than a program of wilderness education. Both kinds of camp-lit evening fires. Neither would have described itself, at the time, as occupying the same rung of the same ladder as the other. Documenting Ahmek's council ring honestly means documenting this alongside it, not underneath it in a footnote. The ring that made 60 boys equal to one another for 1 hour a night was itself the product of an inequality that had already been decided, long before any boy sat down at that fire, about which children in Ontario got access to a ring like this one at all. There is a second limitation this channel will not leave undocumented, because it sits inside the very name of the ritual this episode follows. In 1922, a year after Ahmek opened, Taylor Statten invited the naturalist and author Ernest Thompson Seton to spend the summer at Canoe Lake, and it was Seton who built the camp's Indian lore program, the council ring itself, along with dances, a sweat lodge, and craft making, all presented to campers at the time as authentic indigenous tradition. It was not. It was Seton's own invention, adapted from the woodcraft Indian movement he had already developed in the United States, and it was performed at camp, for decades afterward, by non-indigenous staff and campers who had been taught to believe they were learning something preserved rather than something recently assembled. This happened, worth stating without softening, during the exact years Canada's federal potlatch law made it a criminal offense for Indigenous peoples to practice their own actual ceremonial traditions, a law that remained in force until 1951. Algonquin Park itself lies within Algonquin and other Anishinaabe traditional territory. A generation of Toronto boys, Douglas Whitcomb among them, learned to sit in something called a council ring and think of it as connected to Indigenous culture, at the very moment Indigenous people in Canada were legally forbidden from gathering to practice their own. This channel does not stage or reproduce that imagery, and will not describe it further than the documented historical fact of its existence. What it will do is document plainly that this happened, and that Taylor Statten camps and independent camp historians today openly acknowledge Seton's program as an inauthentic invention rather than a preserved tradition. That acknowledgement does not cancel out what the ring gave a boy like Douglas on an ordinary Tuesday night in 1933. It also should not be allowed to quietly disappear from how this specific ritual gets remembered, decades later, by a channel that has chosen to document it honestly. The ring itself did not disappear. What changed, across the decades that followed Douglas Whitcomb's boyhood summers at Ahmek, was almost everything standing around it. A highway reached into Algonquin Park's interior by the mid-1930s, ending the long train journey from Toronto that had, until then, been the only practical way in. Taylor Statten's son took over direction of Ahmek in 1954. In 1976, his grandson became director of Wapomeo, and starting in the 1950s and accelerating hard through the 1970s, the informal, camp-by-camp judgment that had governed the council ring's earliest decades gave way to something Douglas's own generation had never known at camp. A provincial camping association, the one Statten himself had helped found back in 1937, writing down water safety requirements, staff training standards, and audited accreditation criteria that no individual camp's leadership could simply set for itself anymore. Fees rose alongside the standards. By the late 1970s, running a camp to the newly formalized accredited requirements cost considerably more than it had ever cost to run one on a director's private judgment alone. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Canadian cottage and camp summer meant to the people who made it their yearly ritual, subscribe. There are more lakes, more council rings, more fishing trips at dawn, and more quiet nights that were the best part of someone's whole year, and were never described that way at the time, because they simply didn't need to be. What a formal safety standard gave a camp like Ahmek was real, and this channel will not pretend otherwise. Trained lifeguards, audited canoe tripping rules, a documented answer for a parent who asked exactly how their son would be kept safe on the water. And if you have a memory of a council ring, a camp song, a summer away from home that changed how you understood belonging, put it in the comments. What's the one detail from a summer campfire circle you have never been able to forget? Next time, on this channel, the evening a boat finally came back into the dock, and what a Canadian father and child carried up from the water that their ordinary year at home never gave them. Camp Ahmek's council ring is still lit, most summers, on the same slope above Canoe Lake. What the 1970s new safety standards gave the boys who came after Douglas Whitcomb: documented water safety training, audited canoe tripping rules, a camp answerable to more than one director's private judgment. What no accreditation standard ever wrote down, because no standard needed to, the specific hour, each night, when rank and home address stopped organizing who a boy was, and all that mattered was whether he knew the words. Douglas Whitcomb did not know, at 11, that this was what the ring had been built to give him. He knew it the summer he came back as a counselor himself, and watched a smaller boy stop crying halfway through the second verse. The ring had known what to do with him. No standards committee ever needed to write that down.